This is Duke University.
So the curriculum vitae, or the CV, literally it means the course of your life, which does imply that you put quote unquote everything in it, right? Now, I put everything in quotes because you don't really put everything in your CV. A CV is an edited document. It is a marketing document, like a resume is an edited document or a marketing document. The CV just looks much more expansive because there's a lower, I don't want to say there's a lower barrier to entry to get on your CV, but just because you have more space, you can put more things. I will say that there are some sort of implied rules about how long a CV should be, depending on where you are in your career. So if like a second year grad student comes to me with a 20-page CV, I'm going to say that is too long. There is something wrong here. Unless you have a very unusual trajectory, you should not have a 20-page CV when you're early on in your graduate student career. But a curriculum vitae is typically going to be 3 or more pages. It's going to focus on your roles or your production over time. So when you mention, oh, list all of your publications, yes, that's production over time. People want to see what you did, when you did it, what was the timeline, what is the finished product, what was the role, what was the progression, you know, from assistant to associate to full professor, for example. A curriculum vitae also assumes a shared vocabulary. You may not have thought of it this way, but part of the reason why there's not a whole lot of language explaining what things mean or what the measurable outcomes were is that if you're writing a CV, it's almost certainly for an academic job. And people in academia assume a shared language. They assume that everyone knows what a professor does. They assume that everyone knows what it means to publish. They assume that everyone knows the difference between peer-reviewed and not peer-reviewed, and everyone knows what these different titles and terms mean. So there is a lot less explanation because part of the genre is if you belong in this setting, you know, right? Which is problematic, but it's how CVs tend to work. They also tend to be very linear, so chronological. Chronological, linear, just very straightforward. They tend to be for academic jobs. And by academic, I mean both faculty and higher ed, although I'll show you an example of how I turned my CV into a resume for higher ed positions. And then they tend to be really specialized. So again, that goes back to the vocabulary. You put every little arcane thing that you've ever done, and you assume that somebody who's reading it may care, right? So it is sort of the kitchen sink of what you've done, even though, again, we're not focusing on CVs today. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it still should be tailored in ways that are perhaps less obvious than a resume. A resume covers the highlights. It is 1 to 2 pages. It never goes over 2 pages. If it goes over 2 pages, it is too long. I don't care what your reason is. That is like the hard and fast rule. It shows, as you all mentioned, measurable outcomes or impacts. So you're really focused on what did I achieve in this specific role? And if you have experience teaching, or if you have experience doing sort of like grant proposal writing, you might be familiar with outcomes orientation in those realms where you're really using action verbs to describe something that you did that can be measured, right? And that is also a very similar format to a resume. There are explanatory bullet points. So people who are really into bullet points tend to like putting them in their resume. They're a little bit more out of place in the CV. I'm always trying to get people to take their bullet points out of their CV and they resist me. In a resume, bullet points are pretty much expected. It can be linear. It can go from, okay, well, I had this job last year and now I have this job this year, and this is what I did last year and this is what I did this year. But they could also be topical. They could also be organized by different types of experience. It's much less likely to follow the sort of set headings that you will see in an academic CV, where everyone knows that they're going to find the same headings in every single person's academic CV. This can be much more creative in a sense. They are for non-academic jobs. You're not going to give somebody a resume for a faculty position. That would be very bizarre. People would not know what to do with it. And it does emphasize also transferable skills. So one thing that I hear from students who are in graduate school and who are looking at alternative academic or non-academic roles is this idea that they somehow are lacking a massive skill set that would then go into their resume seamlessly if they had it. And that's just not the case. So the things that you're doing now, you need to find the language, you need to find the outcomes that you can associate with them to translate them into resume speak that somebody else will understand. So you need to kind of market what you can do very clearly, because it's not going to be intuitive for the person reading it, most likely, in a non-academic space. But we'll look at examples of how to do that as well. Are there any questions or comments or things you want to dispute or add to my list? No, you accept it? Okay, good. Let's apply it. We'll get to the more interesting stuff now. So I call this Extreme Makeover. I call it Extreme Makeover Duke PhD Edition, because when I was in your shoes, I was mostly worried about, I'm writing a CV and my CV is not long enough. So my goal was always to have a longer CV with more things to put in it. And that is kind of the opposite mindset of what you want to have when you're writing a resume. You want it to be shorter, you want it to be more concise, you want every single line on your resume to earn its place on your resume, because there's no room for fluff, there's no room for extraneous stuff. So you have to kind of change your mindset from I must have the longest document possible to show, how accomplished I am, to I must find a way to translate these accomplishments in as short and compact and concise and meaningful and measurable way as possible. So I know that Jay, you asked at the beginning if everyone received the attachments. Now is a great time to pull up the attachments. I don't want to hold up my work as perfect, because it's not. It's not even necessarily exemplary, but it is an example of what happens when you really accept that you cannot give people CVs and expect them to hire you for jobs that are not traditional faculty jobs. And B, you really accept that you need to adopt all of the conventions of the resume, which includes what is called in creative writing, killing your darlings. So there are things that I just had to chop, things that I spent hours on, things I was very proud of, things that, I agonized over when I was doing them. They are not relevant in the context of the resume, and therefore they must go. And you kind of have to make your peace with that.
So in our group, we talked about how teaching is a big emphasis in your CV, but it's basically disappeared in your resume. And also grants and fellowships are something that you put in your CV, but not in your resume. And also in your resume, there's lots of emphasis, even like a single section for leadership. And you have more description about each individual professional roles in your resume.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Does teaching come out in any other way? Because that hurt, right? Like if you teach in the humanities, especially, I think you're teaching I taught 12 courses before I graduated from Duke, and goodbye 12 courses, they're just gone. So does teaching come out in any other way, do you think, in the resume?
I can't remember the details, but I think you still mentioned your position, company, which is Duke, and then I think you maybe included some descriptions in the further information paragraph underneath, that really emphasize the skills you use and results, what you did, how you did it, and the results.
Yeah, that was definitely the attempt, right? I think also tending to emphasize less the teaching and more the curriculum design or the oversight of programs. So thinking about it less as sort of, I went to class every day and I graded and it was really hard. And sometimes my students annoyed me and sometimes they wouldn't learn, they wouldn't learn French and they wouldn't speak French, and like thinking less about the day-to-day and how the pieces fit together as part of a program, how they involve management or how they involve leadership components. Because the other difference between my CV and my resume is I was using my CV to apply for assistant professor roles, which are entry-level faculty roles. And I'm using this version of my resume to apply for assistant dean level roles, where it's assumed that you're going to take more, if not management, at least strong leadership kind of perspective on your work. Yes. What else do you notice that is different or differently emphasized?
We briefly talked about the service section of the CV, which you end up doing a lot of even as a graduate student, and it sort of disappeared in the resume, which kind of makes sense. But I was like, as somebody who has some level of service experience in my CVs, I was wondering how it would be translated when I applied to an industry job, and I couldn't see it directly. Like, could there be instances of your service role which could translate as a leadership role?
Yes.
And how that happens. So I was like keen on that and hearing something on that from you.
I think you're absolutely right. Like I was on a strategic planning, like institution-wide strategic planning committee on an academic CV that would have gone under service. And now that it's on my resume, it goes under leadership because it was institution-wide and it was strategic planning. So I was named to a committee and that's a leadership role. So thinking about, if you're on a committee and you're not doing a whole lot on the committee, that happens sometimes, maybe that's not something you want to translate to your resume. But if you are a co-chair of a committee, or maybe you're planning a conference, or maybe you are on a DEI, like diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, and you have some measurable results from that. Or maybe you've had a role on a committee where there is some kind of outcome that you can highlight. I would call that leadership instead of service. Even in academia, service is not valued the way that it should be. It is not going to get you tenure in and of itself. So if you can reframe it under another heading in your CV and your resume, I would do that definitely, and only keep the highest level things or the things that had the most significant impact. Yeah. All right, we could keep talking about it. Is there anything about the format that you think is different, other than it being much shorter?
Caitlin and I were noting the apparent difference in font size and the compression of the spacing. And so we were wondering, just visually, we couldn't tell what font size it was, but we were wondering how small can you go without irritating your readers?
This is a great question. 11 point. I have an answer. So I don't know how many of you may know this if you've worked at all with Hugh Crumley in the graduate school, but there is a wonderful, wonderful book that I first learned of when I was in graduate school at Duke. And I'm putting it in the chat, which is why I'm just frantically typing, but it's called The Non-Designer's Design Book, and it's by Robin Williams, not the comedian. I'm looking to see if my copy is actually here so I can show it to you. I don't think it is. This is hands down one of the best professional books that I got while I was in graduate school at Duke. And you would not think so. Like, who needs a non-designer's design book? It tells you all kinds of things about principles of typography and graphic design and white space. And it's not targeting, obviously, someone who is studying those things very deeply. It's really for someone who's just trying to brand their own professional documents in a way that communicates what is intended. So like, I've seen people make PowerPoints in Comic Sans. This is very bad. You should not do that. That sends a very, unless you're doing it as a joke, and even then, it sends a message about who you are as a professional. But definitely all of the changes I made in formatting, in terms of like, we're differentiating the fonts in a specific way. we're using one typeface, but we're using different I'm saying this like I'm suddenly the royal we. I'm using different weights. So some versions of the font appear darker than others, some appear larger than others. You may have italics versus other forms of emphasis. But just thinking really consistently about what font am I using and how am I differentiating different categories in a consistent way. So you may not have experienced this. I like to think my intention was that this would be much easier to read in like the 30-second glance it might get the first time someone sees it. Whereas my other one was like, and here's a line. I know that's often something that people do in CVs. They're like, here's a title, here's a line. I'm gonna all caps this thing, and then I'm gonna hope for the best. And now it's a list. So there was definitely more intentional design going into this very short document that I wanted to be readable, but I also wanted to pack in absolutely everything I could that was going to help me get the job. So 11 point is the answer. 12 point sometimes looks, well, I'm quoting Robin Williams. Robin Williams says 12 point sometimes looks dorky. And I have to agree. Sometimes it looks a little bit like, oh, that's the default font size, right? So it just looks kind of dopey. It's kind of like if, you know, I think Calibri is the default in Microsoft Word now. I think Arial sometimes people default to, or Times New Roman. If you can find a jazzier font that expresses, you think, something about yourself, I know that you're going to think this sounds absolutely crazy, but yes, fonts can express different things depending on whether, you know, they're rounded or angular, or they're very, you know, old-fashioned looking, or very, you know, clean and modern looking. And again, the Non-Designer's Design book will walk you through everything you want to know about this in a very fun and easy, digestible way. So I can't recommend it enough. All right. I also use InDesign now, which I didn't used to do. I used Word, and I'm not, you know, I'm not repping InDesign. It is not easy to learn, I don't think. I mean, for me, it was not straightforward. It requires a subscription. I like using it because I find that I have greater control over where things end up on the page. Microsoft Publisher can do similar things. I'm sure there's an Apple product that can do similar things. I'm just a Mac user who loves InDesign. That's my thing. It's part of the Adobe Creative Cloud. And if you become obsessed with, you know, low-key professional branding, graphic design stuff for your own documents, you might want to learn InDesign. Just like I don't know it well. I know it well enough to do what I want it to do. And it makes nice documents that look very consistent. All right, I have not even reshared my slide because I just got so enthralled by that conversation. Thank you. All right, so we have another sort of practical application for you to do. I have pulled a sample CV. I think this comes from University of Illinois, their Career Development Center. I didn't want to pick a real CV from a real person because that seemed invasive and potentially mean, depending on what you talk about and how you talk about it. So I picked a sort of template for a CV. The one that we're going to use is the one that has the heading Rachel Green in that document. And then I've also picked a sample job ad. You'll notice that the sample job ad is for a technical writer. I have intentionally picked a humanist sample CV. This is a person who's done a degree in English. And I've picked a sample job ad that a lot of humanists and potentially social scientists are interested in. Technical writing draws on a lot of transferable skills that you can get from a graduate degree in the humanities or social sciences. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw you back against your will into these breakout rooms. It always sounds like a punishment when I say I'm sending you to your rooms. So I'm sending you to your rooms, and I'm going to ask you to talk through these questions. I know there are a lot of questions. If you don't get to all of them, it's okay. But I really want you to look at this CV, look at this job ad, and think about how you would turn this CV into a resume for the purposes of this specific job ad. And you're not going to come out of this with, you know, a resume designed in InDesign in the next 10 minutes, but you should be able to think through what are some changes, what are some adjustments, what are some measurable impacts, what are some categories, that sort of thing, to really turn this person's work into into a format that people in another industry will understand as valuable. So having said all that, I put you in your rooms for about, we'll say another 10 minutes. But what would you have to say about converting this CV into resume items for Rachel Green if she's applying to Red Hat? You have, go ahead.
So in our group, we talked about how the format should be probably changed a bit. And then some of her experiences, for example, about honors and awards should probably go away in her resume.
Yeah.
And also just because that's a writer, basically like a writer role. So maybe she can put her professional service where she was a managing editor and editorial assistant, like put those experience at the beginning of her resume.
I agree completely. So this thing that's considered professional service on her faculty CV, and which is going to be less valued on a CV, is suddenly going to become the most valuable thing on the resume. And so she's able to talk. I also would advise her to talk more specifically about the outcomes she achieved, because she, oh no, I do still have my internship here. I put it under Duke University. I do still have my internship. I made it a lot smaller. I think she needs to change the language to talk about what it means to oversee the publication process, what it means to correspond with authors, what it means to manage these different aspects, and really emphasize maybe she's very deadline driven. Maybe she's done some work helping authors refine their text to make it more accessible to the audience or to improve it in some way. Maybe she's moved a certain number of manuscripts out the door in a timely manner. I don't know. But I think really digging into what did she achieve through her work managing that process. I think that explaining what that is going to be key for this role. And also thinking about her publications, what she's written, how could you use the language of topic-based writing or technical writing and reframe what you've done? I assume she's worked collaboratively with different subject matter experts. Her work is probably interdisciplinary in some sense. Can she reframe that to really emphasize those parts of the work that she's done? And it's tricky because, you know, in the humanities and to a lesser extent the social sciences, but especially in the humanities, you being your own single author, one person show is what's valued. And in this particular industry setting, being able to work with others to produce a result that is accessible to a specific audience, that's going to be valued. So can you translate that, putting the emphasis on how you collaborated, how you translated and reframed for an audience? Anything else? I know we're right at 1, but is there anything else you would recommend that Rachel does? And by the way, I think Rachel's a great fit for this role. I think she has a really good, sometimes you look at these and you're like, that's so scary. That is not like, I don't know what it means. Like, what does this even mean? This, you know, software and documentation development life cycles, version control systems. What does this even mean? I look at her CV and I say, oh, she has experience in a lot of different publication related settings. She produces a lot of text at a high quality. She's done a lot of research in specialized areas that she's presumably then had to publish in other venues that were maybe less specialized. Talk about that, right? And then look at what Red Hat does. And if you're interested in this job, talk about how their mission aligns with your career goals. And then suddenly you're a great fit for the job, as long as your resume reflects that. Are there... Are there any last questions?
We had a question about one of the points that you said about CV versus resume. So
Yeah.
is there a specific reason why you don't encourage having bullet points in CVs?
Yes, and this is less true, I think, now than it used to be.
Okay.
And it's less true in STEM than it is in the humanities. But the more you explain things that are assumed to be known in academia, the less you look like an insider in academia. And I know that's wrong. I know that's not inclusive. I know that that's very problematic. But I see people all the time, bullet points under graduate instructor, and I'm like, oh, don't do that. Because the people reading this have been graduate instructors. And if you're explaining to them what it means to be a graduate instructor, it doesn't present you as a colleague the way that you want to present yourself. I know that's the answer, but I know it's very, very problematic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I've like never noticed this being an issue of like having bullet points in my CV. And I have another question related to this is also like the formatting. So sometimes in resume, we have like an introductory paragraph about yourself.
Yeah.
So I wonder why you don't have that in your resume, and is it like make a big difference? Would it make a big difference to have it versus not?
It's optional. And so my dissertation was on autobiographical writing in France, and I love writing a good cover letter. I mean, I'm gonna toot my own horn. I write a good cover letter. So I don't feel the need to add any more autobiographical verbiage to the heading. But if you're somebody who is less confident about your cover letter, then by all means, you can add something at the top. You're just going to lose less space to expand on your experience. And I was already cutting a lot, so I'm like, I'll just put that in the cover letter. I love writing a cover letter. Tell you everything about me in the cover letter. I mean, there are things in here that, it's not a repetition, right? Those two documents have to work together. So things that you can't capture adequately in your resume can then become part of the cover letter when you're describing your fit for the job.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And sometimes in the job description that I see, sometimes they just don't have the option that you submit a cover letter. So I think that makes a lot of sense to include that paragraph when there's no,
when you don't have the option, do that. Yes. But anytime you have the option, even if it says optional, I know what it's like to say, I don't want to make another job document. I understand that feeling, but the cover letter gives them the context to understand everything in your resume. So if you have the option, take the option. It can only help you if you're writing something strong that gives them context to understand you.
Yeah, that's super, super helpful. So I think this brings us, does anyone else have any question?
I have a quick question. So any helpful resource or tips how to write a good cover letter?
I am going to be really obnoxious and I'm going to quote myself. Let me pull up. I have a blog that I wrote when I was at NC State. So I'm going to pull up that link.
Sure, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. That is so obnoxious of me to do that, but it is all of my advice about cover letters in one short piece. And this is academic cover letters, but it applies to non-academic cover letters with a few tweaks. The main thing is the fit for the job. Like that's the most important thing you can talk about in your cover letter. Alexandra, I see you have your hand raised.
Oh, yeah, this was just a question I had, but we can address it later. But one was like, I saw your CV or the sample CV and resumes that we looked at, and I saw how good the format was and was curious if you did them in InDesign as you explained, and if you used a template for it, or if you designed it from scratch, basically.
So my resume that I did, like the one that I call new CV, that was me designing it from scratch. And then the older CV, that was, I don't advise you to make a CV like that because it doesn't look fantastic, but that was also me from scratch using Microsoft Word instead of InDesign. But yeah, I don't use templates. because I am a type A control freak when it comes to this stuff. I'm sure there are good templates out there.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Can I just drop in there?
Yes.
Coming from the Career Center, it's always easier if you start from scratch, because you can control it. You can control the margins. If you have to take it to the max limit of 0.5 or each side, even with the resume, start from scratch so you can control it. It's not just type A, Vanessa. Start from scratch.
Adding on to that, on the Career Center, are there like videos or tutorials, or is it best to go to YouTube and look up like resume InDesign tutorials just to get started if we haven't used InDesign very much before?
Yeah, I just actually put up a link. It is the resume guide on the Career Hub website, and there is a section specifically for converting a CV to a resume. Video tips, which can lead you back to some other tips that you probably could use in the other sections of the guide, but there is a guide and it has a specific section.
Thank you.
Thoughts about hyperlinks? I think hyperlinks are fine. I think hyperlinks are absolutely fine, especially if they give people options to go to content that otherwise would exceed what you're able to do in your job application materials. So like having an online portfolio or an online website and including that hyperlink as a place people can explore if they choose to, I think that's a great option. You can either put it in your resume, you can put it in your cover letter, you can put it in both. And then would internships be framed as professional experience or folded into leadership? I think most internships should be framed as professional experience. As an example, my internship at Duke University Press, which now I'm trying to remember if that even shows up anywhere. Oh, no, it doesn't. It had to go away. I worked at Duke University Press for 4 years, and it was a huge deal to me. And it did not end up in my resume because there was no space. I learned a ton of stuff there. It was very important. It's something I have talked about in interview questions. So it's not like this experience disappears. And also I do include freelance editorial work, which includes an ongoing relationship with Duke Press. So that has translated into another part of my profile. The reason that I always include my freelance editorial work at the bottom of my resume is that it shows long-term ongoing relationships that are based around deadlines and reliable production. And it also shows attention to detail, because if, for example, you announce, I have great attention to detail, like they don't know you, why would they believe you? But if you say, I have a 10-year relationship with multiple university presses and they rely on me to produce copy edited text, that says I have attention to detail, I am reliable, I produce things, I understand academic publishing. So I know we're over time, and I just want to say in those slides that Jayu shared with you, my email address is there at the end. And please, I love Duke. I still love Duke. I will always love Duke despite my current place of employment. So if you want to reach out ever for advice, or for if you have other questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, please don't hesitate. And thank you all for being such a great group of participants.
Thank you, Vanessa, for giving this great presentation. And let me quickly share my screen. So here's the Duke Career Hub, where we have all these resources and links. And also there is an upcoming event for especially humanity and social sciences students exploring careers beyond academia. So this is October 25th, 1 to 4 p.m. I believe these are all on Handshake. So if you just log on to Handshake, you should be able to see these events. And then also, if you want to make an appointment with a Duke Career advisor, you can also do that on Handshake. And we have a few more upcoming events, coffee chats, which will have a basically a in-person chat with the Duke alumni, or we have workshops as this one we're having right now. So this upcoming one is about interviewing, and we have another upcoming event, which is about offer letter and a negotiation. So thank you all very much for being here, and thank you, Vanessa, again for giving this great presentation and also all these resources that you provided. So yeah, hope I'll see some of you in our future events.